Good morning. Welcome to Hoofing It in the Morning. With Budget 2026 about to be released, I want to talk about what should be the first test of any budget. Are our children going to be okay? Because New Zealand likes to tell itself it is a fair country. We like to believe that if a child is born here, they will have food, a warm home, school shoes, a doctor when they are sick, and a decent chance. But the numbers tell a darker story. In the year to June 2025, 14.3% of New Zealand children were living in material hardship. That is about 1 in 7 children, around 169,300 children. Material hardship means children living in households going without the basics because of cost. Things like fresh food, proper heating, suitable clothes, doctor visits, and the ability to meet an unexpected bill. Stats NZ measures it as children in households missing 7 or more of 18 essential items because of cost. And Child Poverty Action Group put it bluntly, this is the highest level since 2015 and the third year in a row that child material hardship has risen. So when politicians say they are getting New Zealand back on track, the question is simple. Back on track for who? Because for children in hardship, the track is going backwards. And when you look at the history, the political pattern is hard to ignore. Under John Key's national government, child material hardship was incredibly high. In the comparable Stats NZ series, it reached 16% in 2014 and 17.5% in 2015. Then, under Labour, the rate came down. Not enough? Nobody should pretend Labour fixed child poverty, but the direction changed. By 2022, child material hardship had fallen to 10.6%. Then, under Christopher Luxon's national-led government, it rose again, 13.5% in 2024 and 14.3% in 2025. So the pattern is this: high under John Key, lower under Labour, rising again under Luxon. And that brings us to one of Christopher Luxon's most revealing lines. In 2022, he said, "We don't just do bottom feeding and just focus on the bottom." That quote matters because when you see the child hardship numbers, you have to ask, who exactly is the bottom? Because the bottom includes children in poverty. Children do not choose whether their parent is sick, disabled, escaping violence, caring for a baby, stuck in low-paid work, or surviving on a benefit. Children do not choose cold bedrooms, empty lunch boxes, overcrowded homes, or parents skipping meals so they can eat. So when Luxon says National does not just focus on the bottom, I hear a political worldview. And that worldview shows up in budgets. Under John Key, New Zealand was sold a story. We were told the economy was doing well. We were told National was responsible. We were told they were good with money. But if the economy is supposedly good, while 17.5% of children are going without basics, then the economy is not good. It is only good for some people. The high hardship rates under Key did not happen by accident. They happened in a political environment focused on welfare reform, obligations, sanctions, and getting people off benefits. That was the familiar National Party playbook. Find someone at the bottom, make them the villain, and distract from the policy choices being made at the top. But when governments punch down on low-income parents, children get hit too. At the same time, housing costs were exploding. House prices rose, rents rose, low-income families were pushed harder and harder, and child poverty is not just about income before rent. It is about what is left after rent. So under Key, we had low incomes, rising housing costs, welfare pressure, and a government more interested in looking fiscally tough than making sure children had enough. The result was brutal. In 2014 and 2015, child material hardship hit some of the highest levels in the comparable data. That is part of the real legacy behind the smiling photo ops and the claims of good economic management. Good for who? Because it was not good for the children going without. Then Labour came in and made child poverty reduction a formal government priority. Labour passed the Child Poverty Reduction Act, creating official measures and targets. That matters because once poverty is measured properly, governments cannot pretend they do not see it. Labour also introduced the Families Package, aimed at lifting incomes for low and middle-income families with children. It included increases to the family tax credit, Best Start, the winter energy payment, paid parental leave changes, accommodation supplement increases, and higher support for carers. The official evaluation found real movement. By 20, 21/22, compared with 2017/18, there were 77,000 fewer children in low-income households after housing costs, 45,600 fewer before housing costs, and 28,700 fewer children experiencing material hardship. That is what policy can do. Not perfect, not enough, but better. Labor also lifted main benefits, funded food in schools, expanded support during COVID, and used state intervention to keep families afloat during a global crisis. Again, Labor did not solve poverty. Housing costs stayed too high, food costs rose, families still struggled, but the direction was down. And when child hardship falls, that means real children are better off. Then came Luxon, and the child material hardship rate is now 14.3%. That is about 169,300 children, the highest since the Key era. And this is not just a random blip. It sits alongside political choices. First, benefit indexation. Under Labor, main benefits were linked to net average wage growth, so people on the lowest incomes did not fall too far behind the rest of society. The National-led government changed that back to CPI inflation. That sounds technical, but the effect is simple. Over time, wages usually rise faster than inflation. So if benefits are linked only to CPI, families on benefits fall further behind year after year. That is how poverty deepens quietly. Not always through one dramatic cut, sometimes through a formula. Then came Budget 2024. The government chose tax cuts. But tax cuts are not the same as child poverty reduction. A family with little or no taxable income does not benefit the same way as higher earners. A child in a household surviving on low wages, benefits, insecure work, disability support, or caregiving does not get lifted out of hardship because someone else gets a tax cut. That is why targeted poverty policy matters. Labor's package was aimed at low and middle income families with children. National's budget was framed around tax relief. Those are different priorities. One says, lift the bottom. The other says, we don't do bottom feeding. Then there are school lunches. The Healthy School Lunch program was designed to make sure children in high-need schools got lunch every school day. That directly helps child hardship. It takes pressure off families and means children are not trying to learn while hungry. But the current government redesigned the program to save money. They call that efficiency. But for families living in hardship, a school lunch is not a luxury. It is food. It is stability. It is a child not being hungry in maths class. So the question is not just, did it save money? The question is, what did it take away from children to save that money? Then there is housing. Child poverty and housing are deeply connected. When rent is too high, children go without. When emergency housing access is tightened, the government may be able to claim fewer people are in motels. But that does not automatically mean fewer people are homeless or more children are safely housed. A target can be achieved in two ways. You can solve the housing problem, or you can make it harder to get help. Those are not the same thing. If families are turned away, couch surfing, living in cars, returning to unsafe homes, or disappearing from the official count, then the government has not solved homelessness. It has changed the doorway. And then there are public service cuts. Child poverty is not only about money in the bank, it is also about services, health services, housing support, social workers, schools, food banks, family violence services, mental health support. When those systems are cut, families in hardship are left to carry more alone. And then politicians act surprised when hardship rises. But you cannot cut the ladder and blame people for falling. So let's be clear. Child hardship is not inevitable. It rises and falls with political choices. Labor did not end child poverty. Labor did not do enough. But under Labor, the numbers improved. Under National, the numbers were high during the key years. And now under Luxon, they are rising again. At some point, the government cannot blame everyone else. They are in power, they are making the choices, and children are living with the consequences. So with Budget 2026 about to be released, here is the test. Do not tell me the economy is back on track if 1 in 7 of the children you are using for PR opportunities are living in material financial hardship. That's enough of the Ministry of Misery today. It's now crime time. Let's begin. In 2011, Dan Jones thought his life was coming together. He was 25 years old, working as an Australian federal police officer and dog handler when he met 20-year-old Sarah Jane Parkinson. She worked for an airline. To Dan, she seemed sweet, innocent, old-fashioned, and kind. Within months, they were in love, planning their wedding and building a house together. Dan's family welcomed her in. His parents, Ian and Michelle, had been married for more than 30 years. Michelle was a librarian. Ian was a former Navy engineer. They were a close family, and they wanted the same thing for Dan that most parents want for their child: a happy home, a good partner, and a future. But within a year, small doubts started to appear. Parkinson had no real circle of friends, and she told disturbing stories about her past, stories about previous assaults, abusive exes, and trauma. Dan's family had concerns, but sympathy won out. They did not see her as dangerous. They saw her as someone who had been through a lot. Then, in 2012, everything changed. Sarah Jane Parkinson started working as a clerical assistant at Queanbeyan Police Station. I have no clue if I pronounced that correctly. And it was during her time there that she was building relationships with the very police who would later act on her allegations. She started staying out with work colleagues, and it was there that she met a new lover and started cheating on Dan Jones, her new lover, a New South Wales police officer. Around the same time, she began telling police she was a victim of domestic violence. When she came to work with bruises, police were told Dan was abusing her. But what she allegedly left out was that she had a heart condition that could make her dizzy and cause tunnel vision, contributing to falls, accidents, and injuries. Those bruises, according to Dan's side of the story, were then woven into a false narrative about him. Dan had no idea. Behind his back, he was being painted as violent and dangerous. The first time he realised police were investigating him was when Inspector Anthony Hill called him into Queanbeyan Police Station for what was described as a chat. Dan took his father, Ian, with him. That is, when he learned there was an apprehended violence order being pursued against him. Dan's response was simple. He had not done anything. He went home and asked Parkinson about it. She denied that Dan had ever hurt her. She told Dan's father, Ian, very directly, that there was no truth to it. But by then, the narrative had already started moving through the police system. Dan and Parkinson stayed together for a while, but by late 2013, the relationship was falling apart. Dan suspected she was cheating. In November 2013, the relationship ended. And within days, Parkinson went to Gungahlin Police Station. Again, sorry if there are any Aussies listening to that possibly wildly wrong pronunciation. And while at the police station, made a fresh set of allegations. This time, they were extreme. By January 2014, Dan was facing 32 counts of domestic violence, including GR ape. He had lost his job, his home, and his reputation. He was living under strict bail conditions at his parents' house, while Parkinson was living in the house he had built and paid for. That alone is almost impossible to comprehend. Dan had worked for that house. He had built it as part of the future he thought they were going to share, and now he was paying the mortgage while Parkinson and her new police officer partner were living there. But Parkinson did not stop with Dan. She turned on his family as well. Within a month of Dan's arrest, Ian also found himself facing a court order. One breach, and he too could be jailed. The Jones family realised they were not just supporting Dan through a legal case, they were under siege. They went into defence mode. They installed cameras inside and outside the house. They kept receipts. They wrote detailed diaries. They documented where they were, when they arrived, when they left, and who could verify it. They were living like suspects in their own lives, trying to protect themselves from these false allegations. Ian later described it as going into a war, and then came March 21st, 2014. Police arrived at the Jones family home to arrest Dan again. 4 plainclothes detectives came up the driveway. Dan turned to go inside to get his phone so he could call his lawyer, and police jumped the gate and slammed him against the wall. This new allegation was another accusation of SA against Parkinson. Over the following week, Parkinson added more and more detail. Her final version was horrific. She claimed Dan had come to her home, rammed her head into a retaining wall, jumped on her, forced her to open a condom packet, kicked her, and raped her. But there was evidence that should have stopped it. A photograph showed Dan holding his nephew Hunter earlier that day. It was stamped with the date, time, and location. It showed Dan could not have been anywhere near Parkinson at the time she claimed, but even that did not save him immediately. Because of the seriousness of the charge, Dan was denied bail. He was sent to Goulburn Supermax, an innocent man, a former prison officer, locked inside one of Australia's toughest prisons. That detail is chilling. A former prison officer inside a high-security prison is in danger from the moment he walks in. If other prisoners found out who he was or what he had been accused of, his safety could be at risk. Dan was allowed one phone call. He spoke to his father. His father told him he loved him, and Dan heard his voice break. That phone call broke Dan. Outside the prison, his family were falling apart. They were facing huge legal costs, the loss of Dan's career, the loss of his house, and the very real possibility that he could be jailed for years for something they believed he did not do. And then, finally, the case was handed to Detective Sergeant Lisa Alexander. At first, she believed what everyone else had believed, that Dan was guilty and Parkinson was the victim. But unlike the people before her, she tested the evidence. And the evidence started telling a different story. Parkinson was now making claims that Dan's family were harassing her, threatening her, breaking into her house, stealing from her, and targeting her. But when Detective Alexander looked closely, the stories began to unravel. Parkinson claimed a knife had been used to attack her. Police traced the knife back to her own set, a set of 6 knives where one was missing. She claimed her iPad had been stolen and somehow ended up at the Jones family home. But GPS tracking from her own car showed that Parkinson's car had travelled from her house to the Jones home. In other words, the evidence pointed to her planting it there herself. She claimed someone broke into her car at work, but CCTV showed her leaving work and unlocking her own car. Detective Alexander realised Parkinson had lied to her repeatedly, and if she had lied about those things, maybe she had lied to the earlier investigators too. That was the turning point. The Department of Public Prosecutions called for an emergency bail hearing. Dan, who had been relentlessly pursued into prison, was suddenly someone they wanted out. After 4.5 months in jail, Dan was released. But being released did not mean his life was restored. By then, the damage was already catastrophic. The charges against Dan were eventually dropped, and Parkinson was later prosecuted. After fighting the charges for years, she finally pleaded guilty. She admitted she had made it all up. She was sentenced to 3 years and 1 month in prison, with at least 2 years to be spent behind bars. The prosecution said her motive was greed. The house Dan had built and the money she hoped to get if he was locked away. But her prison sentence did not undo what happened. Dan lost his career. He lost his reputation. He lost his livelihood. He lost his house. His parents spent more than $600,000 trying to prove his innocence. Money they should never have had to spend. And the emotional cost was even worse. Ian and Michelle's marriage, after more than 30 years, did not survive the pressure. The stress, the legal bills, the fear, the anger, and the years of fighting tore their family apart. That is what makes this case so disturbing. It was not just one lie. It was a lie that moved through a system without due diligence and investigation, and a lie that was only exposed because one detective finally followed the evidence. This story is not about saying real victims should not be believed. Real victims of domestic violence in SA must be protected, supported, and taken seriously. But belief must never replace investigation, because when police, prosecutors, and courts stop testing evidence properly, innocent people can be destroyed. Justice did arrive, eventually. But by the time it did, the damage was already done. Thanks for listening. I hope you have a great day. And if you have any news or stories you want me to cover, leave a comment below.